Content warning. Animal cruelty and political violence. Use caution when and where you listen. At least a few times in my life, I've woken up in the middle of the night because I thought I heard something. Was it just a dream? I would wonder to myself, straining my ears to hear something, anything. Sometimes it's easy to identify the source of the noise. A car's tires screeching outside, my annoying cat knocking something over. And instead of checking on what the sound was, sometimes it's easier to just go back to sleep. But for Democratic lawmaker Melissa Hortman, 61st Speaker of the Minnesota House of Representatives, it wouldn't be so easy to fall back asleep. Because on the early morning of Saturday, June 14th, 2025, it was death that made the sound that awoke her, aka Vance Bolter. You see, Vance had been planning this night for some time. He had a list with names on it. Not like McCarthy's list or anything like that, but it has been compared to a manifesto, detailing info of over 44 Democratic officials over the Midwest, and also abortion rights activists, healthcare officials even. Not surprisingly, Bolter is extremely religious, and those who knew him refer to him as a conservative. He was also a doomsday prepper. Hell, you can even go as far as to say an accelerationist, maybe. Just an hour and a half earlier to Bolter's current position outside of Hortman's home, he had been pounding on the door of Democratic Senator John Hoffman, who lived nearby, yelling out that it was the police. And at first, that looked pretty accurate, due to his camouflage attire and black SUV, which was outfitted to look like a somewhat unmarked police vehicle, except for the homemade license plate that said police on it. So much planning, gathering addresses, weapons, ammo. There was even video footage that was later found by Minnesota police officers, which would show extensive stalking. So at first, the half-asleep Hoffman and his wife, Yvette, thought it was the police. They too had been awoken by some loud noise that had them sitting straight up in bed, straining their ears until they heard, "Police." I mean, there had been a surge of violence this year since Trump began his second term, after all. As Hoffman opened the door, he was met with a bright light being shined into his eyes. He and his wife then realized that this was no police officer. "You're not the police," they both shouted, to which Bolter yelled that it was a robbery and pushed his way into the house. It was then that Bolter shot both of them, multiple times, somehow thankfully missing their daughter, who was able to call the real police. Not long after that, Bolter visited the homes of two other Democratic leaders, one of them which was on vacation with family, and the other? Well, after the call from Hoffman's daughter, some very fast-thinking police officers went to check on other officials, just in case. And as one of the officers was checking the home of Democratic Senator Ann Rest, she saw what looked like a police vehicle nearby. She peered inside the vehicle and saw a man whom she naturally thought was a fellow police officer, sitting inside. As she spoke to him, he just stared forward blankly, which of course she thought was kind of weird, but continued on with checking on Senator Rest's home. On her way back to the vehicle, after checking the home, she noticed that the other police vehicle was gone. Less than an hour later, as Bolter stood on Melissa Hortman's front porch, staring at the home and thinking about his plan, he barely noticed the police pulling up. They shouted to him, pulling him back to reality, and then they both exchanged some fire. Vance Bolter then ran into the home and then dozens of rounds of bullets were fired into Melissa, her husband Mark, and also into their beloved dog Gilbert. As the police approached the door, they called for backup and an ambulance, but it was too late. The suspect fled out the back door, abandoning his souped-up vehicle. I hope so much that Melissa, her husband, and their beloved pet never got far enough to really identify the sound that woke them. That they didn't have to experience that extreme fear of seeing death on their doorstep. And so began the manhunt for Vance Bolter. The Hoffmans survived the shooting thanks to their daughter. The direct aftermath of the incident consisted of right-wing news outlets, influencers, Fox News, and the lot claiming a far-left extremist type of narrative. Utah Republican Senator Mike Lee and Elon Musk were amongst the loudest. These unfounded and quite honestly ridiculous rantings only grew after police recovered No Kings protest flyers in the suspect's vehicle, along with 4 guns, tons of ammo, and that long to-do list / manifesto. Yeah, somehow the No Kings protest flyers immediately made it into the media, but not the manifesto part. And as more info was released, details of the list, video footage, a close friend identifying Bolter as, quote, voting for Trump, and saying that accusations of him being left were wrong, there were never any acknowledgement of the false accusations from any of those people who had spread that misinformation. Now, Minnesota doesn't list political affiliations on residence info, but Bolter was a known pro-lifer, even talking about how the U.S. was a terrible place due to its stance on abortion while at a church in Africa. I mean, all the names on the list were Democrats and abortion advocates. Add the fact that he is a known evangelical, a doomsday prepper, and of course his friends saying that he would be deeply offended of being called a Democrat. And of course the suspect, Death, aka Vance Bolter, is innocent until proven guilty by a court of law. Melissa Hortman was known for her activism regarding abortion rights and reproductive health care, as well as trans rights. With the rise of this violent political extremism, which is becoming increasingly common all over the world, always comes the scapegoating of the left. In America, using our First Amendment protections is becoming increasingly dangerous for activists and civilians looking to exercise their right to peaceful protest and free speech. And there's an ongoing discussion about this rise of violent political extremism, the memification of murder, sometimes for no apparent reasons other than what seems to be personal feelings and or beliefs. I'm referring to the Charlie Kirk murderer here. Dude didn't really seem to have any political affiliation, but is or was allegedly in a relationship with a trans person, and that seems to have influenced his actions. Maybe. But anyway, that didn't stop Trump and his cronies from lumping him in with some fucked up fantasy he has of a killer cult of trans people and far-left lunatics. Then there is the forever growing number of school shootings that are so often linked to nihilistic accelerationism type online groups, often with ties to the alt-right groups such as Terrorgram and Atomwaffen Division. Whether the violence is a result of the alt-right pipelines online or from people under pressure due to the constant threat of their rights being heavily impinged on or straight up taken, it seems that the far right itself is trying to hide indicators of the violence pointing towards them, literally gaslighting the public with their grievance politics that it's just not true. I should clarify, by far right, I mean the Trump administration. At this point, I'm just referring to the United States and the situation going on there. It's kind of wild that I've had to slightly edit things that I've written months ago for this episode, since I haven't been able to publish anything for a while due to a stressful summer and then being accepted into the sociology program at the university near me. But anyway, I digress. The most current set of protests against Donald Trump and his abhorrent behaviors since Trump 2.0 began are, as stated earlier, called the No Kings protests. And these things go off over hundreds of cities all over the states, as I'm sure many of you know. And as the people of LA tried to protest against the first large presence of ICE in June 2025, there was almost permission given to use violence if you feel your car is being surrounded by, quote, rioters. Yeah, they mean protesters. Ron DeSantis went as far as to say, quote, it's okay to hit people. The Broward County Sheriff said if a person, quote, let it turn violent, that your family would be receiving your body bag. Let's take a second to talk about why this is completely unhinged, but also nothing new under the sun, or at least under America's history. The action of peaceful protest and assembly is how many things in America have evolved over the last century, including women's suffrage in 1920, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which allowed for women and people of color to be able to buy homes without as much scrutiny or permission from their husband. And thanks to that episode about Phyllis Schlafly, we already know how those protests during the civil rights movements of the 60s were met. Also, we know how many victories were achieved through the protection of the First Amendment rights. And during those times, the fight to abolish slavery, the fight for women's voting rights, the fight for workers' rights, and the fight for equality, which is obviously still ongoing, has always brought about people who oppose these fights for whatever reason and seem to be against the most basic of human rights. When a president goes so far as to demonize people using their protected right to peaceful protest, it shapes a paranoid, hateful, and dangerous environment, making right-wing extremists feel emboldened to commit acts of violence, often with their vehicle under the guise of being surrounded. But who decides when protesters, to quote the Broward County Sheriff's Office, let it turn violent? And what the fuck does that even mean anyway? Because most protests so far have been peaceful. But now keep in mind that I wrote this around the summertime, and I do understand that that hasn't really changed. In fact, as of right now, as I record this, ICE has begun taking people that just seem to get on their nerves as they perform their Gestapo duties. And just yesterday, they detained Robbie Roadstreamer, the guy that's on Instagram, who follows them around to each site they go to and has a radio and a microphone and sings about their corrupt, violent activities. This was in Portland. I mean, have you guys seen Portland? I love their style, the way they're showing peaceful gathering as the violent ICE thugs rampage the city. It looks like such a beautiful place. It isn't the city that's violent. It is the entire Trump administration, using language to dehumanize constantly. Trump has even threatened to destroy what he refers to as the terrorist group Antifa. Who's going to tell him, right? I mean, what a clown, but don't mistake the clowniness and ignorant-sounding aspect of it. There is absolutely method to their madness. It's Stephen Miller behind that curtain, calling the shots. He is America's Himmler, if you ask me. They're making it so that, basically, anyone who uses a platform to disagree with what the Trump regime is doing gives them the right to act aggressively against that in order to protect their precious Fourth Reich. Anyway, again, I digress. I mean, in what reality would a car ever be able to be used as a weapon because someone feels threatened by people on foot? To be honest, all of this is giving huge J. Edgar Hoover vibes during the COINTELPRO era. Except the fact that the FBI was incredibly covert in their criminal activities against the American people, and that activity wasn't discovered until much later when a badass group of activists uncovered documents entailing COINTELPRO operations in a lonely FBI office just outside Philadelphia, PA. Yes, the current situation is much worse because it isn't just the head of the FBI doing the shadiest shit under the sun. Though it's him too. If one can even be comfortable to associate podcaster/public defender Kash Patel as the head of the FBI, it seems to be the entire grand old party, because no one dares to go against the dear leader's demands. But as per the usual, and as you do, let's take a look back at the patterns of the witch hunts and the othering of different groups in order to gain power and privilege through the persecution of others. Because Hoover's getting the band back together, and by that I mean reinventing the hatred of not just so-called communists, as in the red and lavender scares, but expanding that hatred to include other groups considered as other throughout history, because it was never really about communists. I'm Nicole Davenport, and this is Great in the Sack, when misogyny leads to mayhem. Over here at GITS, we support the idea that we the people set the norms that are followed in society. Be the person that stands up against fascism, authoritarianism, and hate. It is time that we reset this far-right hellscape that is taking root all over the world. Is it dangerous to stand up for what you believe in? Sure, it can be. But if we don't stand for what we believe in, what are we even doing? What happened to Charlie Kirk is difficult for many of us to feel empathy for. He spewed hate that, more likely than not, created violent situations for a hell of a lot of people. If we want an equal society, however, where everyone has equal worth, it is a fair question to ask, where is the line? When does rhetoric cross over to violence? And then what? Who's the judge of what is too much? Just something I've been thinking about, and I have no answers to offer, just words. Maybe a bit of hindsight. If someone has all the answers to this, they're most likely a charlatan or a cult leader. I'd also like to add that I've missed you guys. I've missed podcasting. I already told you all about university. It's incredibly time-consuming, so it's going to be kind of tough to get episodes out in a timely fashion. Not that I was good at that before. Still, I will get them out when I can. And thank you, dear listener, for understanding and being here. For this episode, I will record about an hour's worth of material I've written. As my fave podcaster, Molly Conger, of the show about white supremacy called Weird Little Guys, indicates, all of these episodes are basically like one long story, with a non-linear timeline anyway. So, I must focus less about the episodes being neat and tidy in order to get more episodes out quicker. We'll see how far we get into this segment of witch hunts and othering through history. Anyway, with all that being said, let's get into it. Have you guys ever heard the phrase, the fifth column? Merriam-Webster defines it as a group of secret sympathizers or supporters of an enemy that engage in espionage or sabotage within defense lines or national borders. It actually originates from the Spanish Civil War, inspired by rebel General Emilio Mola. Mola predicted Madrid would fall, as his 4 columns of rebel troops were approaching the city because they'd soon be joined by another hidden column of sympathizers within it, aka the 5th column. But history tells us that Mola's 5th column never joined. Madrid did not fall, and historians debate that Mola may have been just trying to pump up his supporters. But doesn't it sound kind of catchy? The term was also used to describe Nazi sympathizers residing in different countries that would rise up and help Hitler take over when the time was right. A useful rhetorical turn of phrase that could easily induce fear and be used to control. Which is probably why J. Edgar Hoover latched on to the phrase. During a HUAC hearing, remember, HUAC stands for the House of Un-American Activities Committee, and it was a huge deal during the Second Red Scare. Anyway, Hoover said, quote, "The Communist Party of the United States is a 5th column if there ever was one. It is far better organized than were the Nazis in occupied countries." He goes further even. "The American progress which all good citizens seek, such as old age security, houses for veterans, child assistance, and a host of others, is being adopted as window dressing by the communists in order to conceal their true aims and entrap gullible followers." End quote. I had to get my old-timey white man voice on for that. I mean, the way this guy speaks about communism is quite literally how Trump is describing Antifa now, isn't it? In the last episode, we spoke about both Red Scares and the Lavender Scare, and a bit of its relation to the present day. Now, as we know, the Lavender Scare lasted longer, with the more damaging effects to the LGBTQIA community, which are still felt today. But just because the Red Scare technically ended, doesn't mean Hoover suddenly went, as they said during that time period, soft on communism. He just let McCarthy take the fall for it while he regrouped. Hoover knew that his large budget he wanted for his beloved FBI had to be justified. Could he still use the guise of communists as the dangerous enemy within? If you answered yes, come get your prize, because that is exactly what he did. In August 1956, Hoover created the very classified Counterintelligence Program, otherwise known as COINTELPRO, which, in the words of the document, were to, quote, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize, end quote, the Communist Party USA, CPUSA. FBI agents wrote anonymous letters to party members to sow distrust, suggesting betrayals, affairs, or ideological impurity. Get this, agents would even pose as Marxist hardliners, accusing others of being FBI informants. By the early 1960s, the CPUSA was just saturated with FBI informants. It was said that some cells had more informants than actual party members. One CPUSA leader famously complained that the only real communists left in the party were the FBI agents assigned to infiltrate it. FBI would feed anti-communist stories to newspapers and magazines, shaping public opinion to align with Bureau goals. There was some damage done too, of course. CPUSA members were outed to employers, unions, and social clubs, often resulting in firing or blacklisting, even social ostracization. The CPU's influence, however, was much less by this point, for obvious reasons, which makes it clear that COINTELPRO was less about real threat and more about control and suppression of political dissent. That probably took the fun out of the game for Hoover. So he decided to broaden that game, starting with people of color. Hoover has been known to say things like, quote, "The greatest danger to America is the unity of Negro people," end quote. But for some reason, he still wanted to portray the FBI as diverse. Take this, for example. In 1947, Hoover set up an article cover for the magazine Ebony in order to show that, hey, that FBI is so progressive. Spoiler, they weren't. Hoover had some of his so-called agents of color photographed for the cover and for the articles within the magazine. But these folks were completely exploited because, in reality, people of color were only permitted to work as chauffeurs and clerical workers within the FBI. The man photographed for the cover of Ebony, holding an Uzi or something like that, was one of Hoover's chauffeurs, which, of course, was by design by Hoover himself. Looking back with all the info we know now, maybe this was a tactic to make him look like he wasn't at all racist, because of what he had planned. You see, it all started in 1955, not long after the Montgomery bus boycott began. The bus boycotts weren't really at all about buses, by the way. They were about dignity and human rights. After Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man, Black residents of Montgomery organized a 13-month-long protest against the city's segregated public transportation system. By the way, this wasn't just some day that Rosa Parks had had enough. This was a systematic tactic that they had put into place. She was a part of the movement, a huge part. The movement was grassroots, led by Black women and community members, and a young pastor named Martin Luther King Jr., who quickly became its most visible spokesperson. But it was hard. People walked for miles. Black taxi drivers lowered their fares to help. And in the end, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. This would be one of MLK's first triumphs. He would embark on a dangerous path of activism, sit-ins, and marches that would demand desegregation, civil rights, and voting rights for people of color. And to J. Edgar Hoover, King's rising profile and the community power behind him was a threat. By 1956, the FBI had already begun wiretapping King's phone. Hoover claimed he was worried about communist influence, pointing to King's association with people like Stanley Levison, who had once been involved with leftist politics. But it's not hard to see through that. Hoover used communism as a catch-all excuse to justify what really looked like complete control. Authoritarianism against any political dissent. J. Edgar Hoover would develop a personal obsession with discrediting Martin Luther King Jr., and not just behind closed doors. He weaponized the power of the FBI to shape public opinion, drip-feeding rumors and surveillance reports, even smear material to journalists and politicians. But it wasn't just about destroying King's credibility. It was about undermining the entire civil rights movement, as we will see through much of the COINTELPRO operations. King would also speak out against the Vietnam War, which really rained on Hoover's communist fighting spirit. For real, though, it really burned his ass. Hoover would go on to tell the press that King was a communist sympathizer, even if the FBI had no real evidence to back that up. And as we know by the people emboldened by Trump's disgusting and tiresome rhetoric of today, language matters. When a man with Hoover's reach and power frames a nonviolent leader as dangerous, it gives people, especially those already inclined to that hatred, permission to act violently or justify their racism under the guise of patriotism. It seems like anywhere there were people who want rights or equality, or even to stand up for those who have no power, no voice, there will always be people to oppose them, kind of as we talked about earlier. White supremacists didn't need much encouragement, but Hoover's actions added gasoline to the fire. Painting King as a threat to national security made violence feel like it was a defense of the country, to extremists anyway. It also confused well-meaning white moderates who might have otherwise supported King. But government officials and police probably also felt like Hoover was damn near giving them permission to act out violently against the activists. This went for police officers and the like. There wasn't so much glorification and joking going on about activists being injured or killed like today, but it was all so covert that wasn't necessary. And things, they only escalated from there. During the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956, King's home in Montgomery, Alabama, was bombed while his wife and baby daughter were inside. No one was injured. But as you may recall in the last episode, neither was Attorney General Palmer of the first Red Scare when his home was bombed, and we know how he reacted to that. Because we listened to part 3, right? Anyway, in 1957, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC as it's also known, was formed in order to be able to influence civil rights through peaceful protests and sit-ins by using the moral authority and organization skills of the black churches. King was the leader of the SCLC until the day he was assassinated. So, in 1958, a woman named Isola War Curry, a mentally unstable woman of color, stabbed King in the chest with a letter opener. She said she believed he was a part of a communist plot. Now, while there's no direct evidence she was influenced by Hoover, the language she used, claiming King was connected to communism, mirrored the exact public narrative Hoover was pushing. Then came the Atlanta sit-ins in October of 1960. Many were arrested and released soon after, except King, who was kept due to something on his criminal record. You see, after King was pulled over and harassed for not having a license issued from the state of Georgia, where he'd just moved to from Alabama, his lawyer had taken a plea deal, which came with a side of probation. There were no time limits or specific laws against not having a state-issued license at that time either. So he was soon after sentenced to 4 months of hard labor. It was then that the Kennedys came through for him, JFK to be exact. He and his bro began pressing authorities for King's release. He also called King's wife, Coretta, to ask what he could do to help. 2 days later, he was released. Side note, MLK's pops went all in for JFK after this, openly supporting his campaign, which, as we know, he won by the skin of his teeth. By 1962, King's name was shuffled into the ever-so-widening COINTELPRO operation. What that meant in practice was round-the-clock surveillance, wiretaps, bugs in hotel rooms, tracking his travel, even tapping his advisors. This surveillance, sadly, was authorized by RFK under extreme duress immediately after his brother was assassinated. Everyone was afraid of saying no to Hoover, and still, even in 1962, 40 years after the very first Red Scare, in which Hoover was also a huge part of, no one wanted to look soft on communism. Any power RFK had was out the window after JFK was gone. It's also fair to say that Hoover may have had something on RFK. Blackmail, maybe even concerning a certain Marilyn Monroe, with whom RFK, in addition to his brother, had an extramarital affair with. Anyway, MLK was arrested during the peaceful protests and boycotts in Alabama after the bus boycotts, and it was while imprisoned that he began forming his ideology for peace and equality, and soon after, he gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech during the march through D.C. He also criticized the FBI for being, quote, completely ineffectual in resolving the continued mayhem and brutality inflicted upon the Negro in the Deep South, end quote. And well, as one can imagine, Hoover didn't take that lightly. In a press conference in November 1964, Hoover called MLK the, quote, most notorious liar in the country, end quote. Seemingly taken aback by the statement of Hoover, MLK said that Hoover must, quote, be under an immense amount of pressure, end quote, to say such a thing, taking the high road. In March of 1965, King arranged a meeting with Hoover, which Hoover accepted upon encouragement from Lyndon B. Johnson, the then president. Though the encounter was civil, Hoover reportedly lectured King about the history of the FBI, no doubt boasting his own importance in an attempt at a power play. The wildest part is that after this, the FBI sent an anonymous package to King's home in November of 1964. In said package were audio recordings of not just one, but many alleged extramarital affairs, all edited, spliced together, and out of context. Wow, how convenient. And also a note, well, a letter, really. So MLK was to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, the much sought-after prize that, in the present time, Trump would have done anything to get his hands on December 10th, 1964 in Oslo, which, of course, we know he accepted. Hoover couldn't stand this, which is where the package comes into play. You see, this package that was sent to King was supposed to be from a person of color, condemning King in the letter for the extramarital affairs and for being a, quote, imbecile, a term often and unfortunately used to describe people with special needs and such during that time period, who was evil and ungodly. The audio recordings are said to be muffled and difficult to decipher by Loretta, who never believed they were of her husband at all. And after all of the illegal activities that the FBI are and will come to be involved in with COINTELPRO, it's hard to take anything they say as truth, in my opinion. I guess it was supposed to look as though this person and whichever organization that they were a part of obtained these recordings through infiltration. Hoover's obsession with King and also alleged illegal surveillance of King at the hands of the FBI had already begun to surface. So, I mean, MLK pretty much knew who sent the package from the get-go. And if I'm being honest, the letter sounds just like how a white supremacist would have expressed themselves in 1964. And what do you guys think Hoover and his FBI agents were? If you recall from Part 3, Hoover handpicked each agent not according to experience or education, not necessarily anyway. He went with height, looks, skin color, then maybe qualifications after the fact. Maybe that sounds a little bit familiar to how the current regime in the White House is doing things. Anyway, I always come back to the idea that Hoover did this for himself, so he could have some eye candy around. But I digress. The rhetoric of the letter isn't too different from how a white supremacist, or half of current-day America maybe, would speak to or about a person of color nowadays. except maybe instead of the religious type of speech, there would be 4chan and manosphere ease instead. We now know, or at least presume, that the letter which was included in the package was the work of the Deputy Director of the FBI, William C. Sullivan, and we will get to how we know that in a bit. Sullivan was legit drinking the FBI Flavor Aid. He was deep in the cult, and Hoover was the dear leader. I mean, all you have to do is just listen to this internal FBI memo, dated August 1963, just after the March on Washington. Sullivan writes, quote, "In the light of King's powerful demagogic speech yesterday, he stands head and shoulders above all other Negro leaders put together when it comes to influencing great masses of Negroes. We must mark him now, if we have not done so before, as the most dangerous Negro of the future in this nation from the standpoint of communism, the Negro, and national security." What a fucking pick-me, right? Anyway, this letter is referred to as the suicide letter. I'm only going to read the last 8 or 9 lines of it, as it's kinda long. I'm going to give a little extra trigger warning here, because it's really just ugly racism, and also there's mentions of suicide. Here we go. Quote, "Listen to yourself, you filthy abnormal animal. You are on the record. You have been on the record. All your adulterous acts, your sexual orgies extending far into the past. This one is but a tiny sample. You will understand this. Yes, from your various evil playmates on the East Coast to, redacted, and others on the West Coast and outside the country, you are on the record. King, you are done. The American public, the church organizations that have been helping Protestant, Catholic, and Jews, we will know you for what you are. An evil, abnormal beast. So will others who have backed you. You are done. King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what that is. You have just 34 days in which to do." And then in parentheses it says, "This exact number has been selected for a specific reason. It has definite practical significance." End of parenthesis. You are done. There is but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is barred to the nation. End quote. Most people, including King himself, felt that the letter was urging him to take his own life. There are others, though, that insist that the letter was just urging King to decenter himself from the movement. I'm quite sure, however, that Hoover and his crew knew of at least one of the 2 attempts King made to take his own life as an adolescent, mainly after his grandmother passed away. That would kind of make sense as to why the letter pushed to coerce King to take his own life. Beverly Gage, historian and author of G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century, discusses the FBI's tactics and confirms that the audio recordings sent to King were very selectively edited. The letter included a sex tape assembled from FBI surveillance, and the FBI agent who made the tape did splice the recordings together, removing context and amplifying lurid details. She writes, quote, "The tape was not simply a single recording of a single encounter. It was instead a compilation of recordings made at different times, spliced together to maximize embarrassment." End quote. While today's hateful rhetoric and populist far-right grievance politics of Trump and the GOP is quite overt, Hoover's was behind closed doors, where he worked with media contacts and congressional allies to push the image of King as a fraud, morally, politically, and even spiritually. His obsession was deeply personal and rooted in a distorted sense of morale and racial superiority. But as the outright hate was more covert during this time, the violence was quite overt, as we've heard about so far. Even after King's 1968 assassination, there were still discussions within the Bureau and press about airing those tapes. That's how far the campaign to discredit him went. Not just to silence him, but to really ruin him, disrupt him, discredit him, misdirect, or otherwise neutralize him. In the words of the COINTELPRO document itself, disgrace him, even in death. And while we may never know for sure, there's something super weird and uncomfortable about the fact that Hoover, who many allege was in a long-term romantic relationship with his second-in-command, Clyde Tolson, as we spoke about in the previous episode, chose to go after a man whose private life he could scandalize and weaponize. It's giving the lady doth protesteth too much, and it only gets worse from here. The year before King's assassination in 1967, the FBI launched COINTELPRO, the Black Nationalist Hate Groups Edition, a covert operation that targeted, quote, subversive, there's that word often used during the Red Scares, civil rights groups, in which King was obviously a part of long before the formalization of this so-called operation. But it also began targeting organizations like the Black Panther Party for self-defense. And that's where we're going to pick back up next time. As I said, I'm trying to make it so I can get more episodes out quicker. And in order to do that, the episodes won't be maybe quite as long. But I feel that the most important part is telling this part of history, especially with the way Trump is trying to whitewash racism and slavery in American history. I can't wait to see you guys next time. Stay vigilant, stay vocal, because silence is complicity. Bye.